The youth pastor kept isolating my daughter for counseling sessions that left her anxious and withdrawn. I exposed him in front of the entire congregation. I noticed the change in my daughter Sophie after the third private counseling session with Pastor Derek. She'd been 15 and struggling with typical teenage anxiety about grades and friendships when our church's youth pastor offered to meet with her one-on-one to provide spiritual guidance. It seemed like a blessing at the time. Derek was 28, charismatic, and beloved by every family at Cornerstone Community Church. Parents lined up to get their kids into his youth group. He had a degree in theology and psychology, spoke at conferences, and had grown our youth ministry from 12 kids to over 60 in just 2 years. My husband Paul and I had been thrilled when Derek took special interest in helping Sophie. But after that third session, Sophie stopped talking at dinner. She'd pick at her food and stare at her plate, jumping when anyone spoke to her. When I asked how the counseling went, she'd say it was fine in a voice that sounded hollow. I told myself she was processing difficult emotions, that real therapy sometimes got worse before it got better. Derek had explained that Sophie needed intensive spiritual warfare because she was under demonic attack. He said the enemy was targeting her specifically because she had such a powerful calling on her life. Paul and I had nodded along when Derek explained his approach, citing Bible verses about spiritual battles and the armor of God. He said Sophie needed private sessions without parental interference because the presence of family sometimes allowed demons to hide. I'd felt uneasy but pushed it down, reminding myself that Derek had training and credentials, that he'd helped so many other kids, that questioning a man of God was probably my own pride talking. The sessions increased to twice a week, then 3 times. Derek said Sophie's case was more serious than he'd initially thought, that breaking through her spiritual bondage required consistent pressure. He started texting Sophie directly to schedule sessions, messages that came through at odd hours, 10 at night, 6 in the morning. I saw one flash across her phone screen while she was in the bathroom. The enemy is lying to you about what we discussed. Don't believe the doubt. See you tomorrow at 4. When I asked Sophie what that meant, she flinched and grabbed her phone away, stammering that it was just about homework for youth group. Her hands shook while she talked. I started paying closer attention. Sophie stopped attending regular youth group meetings on Wednesday nights, only going to her private sessions with Derek in his office. When I suggested she might benefit from group interaction with other teens, Derek pulled me aside after Sunday service and explained that Sophie was too vulnerable right now, that the other kids wouldn't understand her spiritual battle, that isolation was temporary but necessary for her healing. He put his hand on my shoulder and said he knew this was hard for me as a mother, but I needed to trust the process and trust God's leading through him. His eyes were so sincere, so filled with concern, that I felt guilty for doubting. Paul said we should be grateful someone was investing so much time in our daughter's spiritual development. Our senior pastor, Mark Grayson, had personally vouched for Derek's methods when I'd mentioned my concerns after a service. Mark said Derek's approach was unconventional but effective, that several parents had reported breakthroughs with their struggling teens. He reminded me that spiritual warfare was real and sometimes required strategies that made us uncomfortable. Sophie's grades started dropping. She'd been a straight A student, but suddenly she was turning in assignments late or not at all. Her teachers sent emails expressing concern. When I confronted her about it, she burst into tears and said she couldn't concentrate, that her thoughts were confused, that maybe she was broken the way Pastor Derek said. I asked what she meant by broken and she shut down completely, locking herself in her room for hours. I tried talking to her through the door, but she wouldn't respond. That night, I heard her crying in her sleep, these awful gasping sobs that made my chest hurt. I went into her room and held her while she stayed asleep, her whole body tense even in unconsciousness. The next morning, she didn't remember crying and insisted she was fine when I asked. She had a session with Derek that afternoon and came home even more withdrawn, her eyes red and swollen. When I asked if she'd been crying during counseling, she said no in a voice that sounded robotic, rehearsed. I noticed bruises on her wrists, faint purple marks that looked like finger impressions. I grabbed her arm gently and asked where the bruises came from. Sophie pulled away fast and said she'd bumped into something at school, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. My stomach dropped because I knew she was lying, could see the fear behind her words. I asked directly if anyone had hurt her and she started shaking, stammering that she couldn't talk about it, that Pastor Derek said what happened in counseling was confidential, that breaking that confidence would give demons access to attack our whole family. Her voice got higher and more panicked as she talked, saying Pastor Derek warned her that if she told anyone about their sessions, God would punish us, that her little brother might get sick, or I might have an accident. She was crying now, begging me not to ask questions, saying she just needed to get through this and then everything would be better. I pulled her into a hug and felt how thin she'd gotten, her ribs prominent under her shirt. She'd always been slender, but this was different. This was weight loss from stress and fear. I called Derek that evening and asked to sit in on their next session. He said absolutely not, that my presence would undo weeks of progress, that Sophie needed a safe space to work through trauma without parental judgment. I said I wasn't judging, but I was concerned about physical marks and her declining mental state. Derek's voice got harder, and he said the bruises were from spiritual oppression manifesting physically, that demons sometimes left marks during deliverance sessions, that this was normal in intensive spiritual warfare. He said my doubt was actually a form of spiritual attack on Sophie's healing process, that the enemy was using me to undermine the work God was doing. He suggested I might need counseling myself to deal with my control issues and lack of faith. I felt anger flash through me at the manipulation, but kept my voice calm and said I wanted to speak with Senior Pastor Mark about the situation. Derek said, of course, that transparency was important, and he'd be happy to meet with all of us together. He sounded so reasonable and cooperative that I second-guessed myself again. The meeting with Pastor Mark happened 3 days later in his office. Derek sat next to Mark behind the desk, while Paul and I sat across from them in chairs that suddenly felt too low, putting us physically below their eye level. Mark opened with prayer, asking for wisdom and unity, then asked me to share my concerns. I explained the bruises, the weight loss, Sophie's increasing anxiety, the late-night texts, the isolation from other kids. Derek listened with a sorrowful expression, and then responded with calm authority. He said he'd been documenting Sophie's case carefully and had extensive notes showing her progress. He pulled out a file folder and showed us entries describing Sophie's supposed spiritual oppression, her confession of having dark thoughts, her admission that she'd experimented with occult practices through friends at school. My mouth fell open because Sophie had never mentioned any of this to us. Derek said she'd specifically asked him not to tell us because she was ashamed and feared our reaction. He said the bruises came from her own hands during episodes where the demonic influence took control and she'd hurt herself. He'd grabbed her wrist to stop her from causing more damage. Paul looked horrified and asked why we hadn't been informed about self-harm. Derek said he'd planned to tell us once Sophie was stable enough to handle our emotional reaction, that premature disclosure could trigger a crisis. Mark nodded along and said Derek's documentation looked thorough, and his methods aligned with accepted spiritual warfare practices from multiple ministry sources. He showed us books and articles supporting intensive deliverance counseling for teens under demonic attack. I felt trapped in this room with 3 men telling me my maternal instincts were wrong, that I was misunderstanding the situation, that my daughter was in more danger than I knew, and only Derek could help her. I asked to see Sophie's written consent for these sessions and for her account of what was happening. Derek said minors didn't need to provide written consent when parents had already approved, and that Sophie's verbal accounts during sessions were confidential pastoral counseling protected by religious privilege. Mark backed him up and said the church's legal counsel had confirmed Derek's approach was within proper boundaries. I looked at Paul, hoping he'd support me, but he was nodding along with Mark and Derek, completely convinced by their explanations. I left that meeting feeling crazy and isolated, but more determined to find the truth. That night, I went through Sophie's room while she was showering, searching for evidence of the occult practices Derek described. I found nothing except a journal hidden under her mattress. My hands shook as I opened it, knowing I was violating her privacy, but needing to understand what was really happening. The entries from 3 months ago showed a normal teenage girl writing about crushes and friend drama and worries about college. Then the entries after her counseling session started became darker and more confused. Pastor Derek says I invited demons by listening to secular music. He made me confess every song I've listened to this year. It took 2 hours and he wouldn't let me leave until I remembered every single one. He said my memory problems are proof the demons are hiding things from me. Another entry. Today, Pastor Derek said I need to physically punish myself when I have impure thoughts. He showed me how much pressure to use when pinching my wrists. He watched while I did it 20 times. He said pain is how we crucify the flesh. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the journal. I kept reading, each entry more disturbing than the last. Pastor Derek says I'm special to him, that God told him I'm going to be his spiritual daughter. He said our bond is sacred, and if I tell anyone about our sessions, I'll break that bond and lose God's protection. He hugged me for a long time today and said he's the only one who really understands me. The final entry from yesterday. I can't do this anymore, but I have to. Pastor Derek said if I stop coming to sessions, the demons will fully possess me and I'll hurt my family. He said he's seen it happen before. A girl stopped counseling, and within a month, she killed her little brother. I can't let that happen to Ethan. I have to keep going to the sessions no matter what Pastor Derek makes me do. God is testing me, and I have to be strong enough to pass the test. I sat on Sophie's floor holding that journal and realized my daughter was being systematically abused under the cover of spiritual authority. Derek had isolated her, manipulated her with fear, created a framework where questioning him meant rejecting God, and used his position of trust to exercise complete control over a vulnerable child. I took photos of every page of the journal with my phone, hands still shaking, making sure the images were clear and legible. Then I carefully put the journal back exactly where I'd found it. Sophie couldn't know I'd read it yet because I needed her to keep acting normal while I figured out how to stop this. I called my sister Monica in California, the only family member I trusted not to immediately side with church authority. Monica was a social worker who dealt with abuse cases professionally. I sent her the journal photos and explained the situation in a long voice message, trying to keep my voice steady and failing. She called me back within 20 minutes, and her voice was tight with controlled rage. She said everything I'd described fit the pattern of spiritual abuse and grooming, that Derek's methods were textbook manipulation tactics used by predators in positions of religious authority. She said the isolation, the fear tactics, the physical contact disguised as spiritual warfare, the secret keeping, all of it pointed to calculated abuse. Monica said I needed to report this to the police immediately and to document everything, that churches often covered up abuse to protect their reputation, and I couldn't trust the church leadership to handle this appropriately. I told her about the meeting with Pastor Mark and how he'd supported Derek completely. Monica said that was classic institutional protection of an abuser, that Mark was either complicit or dangerously naive, and either way, he couldn't be trusted. She said churches often enabled abuse because they valued authority structures and reputation over child safety. She told me to call the police that night and make a formal report about suspected child abuse. I said I was scared of what would happen if Derek found out, scared he'd convinced Sophie so thoroughly that she'd defend him, scared the church would turn against us and we'd lose our entire community. Monica's voice got softer, and she said I had to choose between protecting my daughter and protecting my comfort, that those were the only options here. She said abusers relied on victims' fear and on communities prioritizing peace over justice. She said if I didn't act now, Derek would continue having access to Sophie and the abuse would escalate. That snapped something in me. I called the police non-emergency line and asked to speak to someone about suspected child abuse. They transferred me to a detective named Lisa Moreno, who specialized in crimes against children. Detective Moreno listened to my entire story without interrupting, then asked me to come to the station the next morning with all the documentation I had. She said the journal photos were good evidence, but she'd need to interview Sophie directly. I explained that Sophie had been manipulated into believing that talking about the sessions would bring harm to our family, and that she'd likely defend Derek initially. Moreno said that was common in abuse cases involving trusted authority figures, that victims often protected their abusers out of fear and misplaced loyalty. She said they had forensic interviewers trained to talk with children who'd been psychologically manipulated. She asked if Sophie had another counseling session scheduled with Derek, and I said yes, the next afternoon. Moreno told me to cancel it immediately, to cite a family emergency or illness, anything to keep Sophie away from Derek while they investigated. She said once an investigation started, they'd issue an order preventing Derek from contacting Sophie. I canceled the session via text to Derek, saying Sophie had a stomach bug. He responded within minutes, saying he'd pray for her quick healing and that missing sessions was dangerous right now, that Sophie needed consistent spiritual coverage or the enemy would take advantage of the gap. The message made my skin crawl. The next morning, I told Sophie she had a doctor's appointment for her weight loss and anxiety, which was technically true since I'd scheduled one with her pediatrician for later that week. Instead, I drove her to the police station where Detective Moreno and a forensic interviewer named Keisha Williams were waiting. Sophie started panicking when she saw where we were, asking why we were at the police station, saying she hadn't done anything wrong. I held her hand and said she wasn't in trouble, that I needed her to talk to some people about what had been happening with Pastor Derek. Her face went white, and she started crying, saying she couldn't, that something bad would happen if she talked, that I was making a terrible mistake. Keisha approached us with a calm, gentle manner and introduced herself, explaining that her job was to listen to kids and help them feel safe. She said nothing. Sophie said would get her in trouble, that we just wanted to understand what had been happening in her counseling sessions. Sophie looked at me with pure terror in her eyes, and I almost backed out, almost told Keisha we'd made a mistake and we should leave. But then I remembered that journal entry about the girl who supposedly killed her brother, the fear Derek had planted so deeply that Sophie believed she was capable of murder if she didn't submit to his control. The interview took 2 hours. I waited in another room with Detective Moreno while Keisha talked to Sophie in a specialized interview room designed to be non-threatening. Moreno explained that they'd record everything and that the recording would likely be used in court if charges were filed. She said based on what I'd described, Derek would probably face charges of child abuse, assault, and potentially sexual misconduct, depending on what Sophie disclosed. I felt sick hearing those words out loud, the clinical terms for what had been done to my daughter. When the interview ended, Keisha came out and her professional mask had cracked slightly. She looked shaken. She told Moreno they needed to arrest Derek immediately, that Sophie's account described systematic psychological abuse, physical punishment disguised as spiritual discipline, and inappropriate touching during prayer sessions. Keisha said Derek had been escalating his behavior, and based on patterns in similar cases, he was likely grooming Sophie for more serious sexual abuse. She said we'd interrupted that process before it reached the worst stages, but the damage already done was severe. Sophie came out of the interview room looking exhausted and smaller somehow, like telling the truth had physically diminished her. She grabbed onto me and started sobbing, saying she'd broken her promise to Pastor Derek, that something terrible was going to happen now, that it was all her fault. Detective Moreno arrested Derek that afternoon at the church. I heard about it from 5 different people within an hour. Angry phone calls and texts demanding to know why I'd sent police after a godly man who was only trying to help troubled teens. One woman from the women's ministry told me I was destroying Derek's life with false accusations because I couldn't handle my daughter's spiritual problems. Another church member said I was being used by Satan to attack the youth ministry. Paul came home from work furious, saying his boss who attended our church had confronted him about the arrest, asking if our family was really going to drag the church through a scandal. Paul said I should have talked to him before going to the police, that we could have handled this within the church, that now everyone was going to think our daughter was mentally unstable and making things up. I stared at my husband and realized he'd chosen the church's reputation over our daughter's safety. I told him to get out of our house and he looked shocked, saying I was being irrational and emotional. I said if he didn't believe Sophie and support her, he needed to leave. He grabbed his keys and left, muttering about how I'd lost my mind. Senior Pastor Mark called an emergency meeting of church leadership and invited me to attend. I showed up with Monica, who'd flown in that morning, and a lawyer Monica had connected me with named James Hernandez, who specialized in religious institution abuse cases. The room went silent when we walked in. Mark sat at the head of a long table with Derek's wife Amanda next to him, along with the elder board members, all men. Mark opened with prayer and then addressed me directly, saying the church was deeply concerned about the allegations against Derek. He said they'd conducted their own internal investigation and found no evidence of wrongdoing. He said Sophie was a troubled teen with documented mental health issues, that Derek's notes clearly showed she'd been self-harming and having dark thoughts, that his counseling had been appropriate and helpful. Amanda spoke up, her voice shaking, saying her husband was a man of God who dedicated his life to helping kids, that these accusations were destroying their family. She said Derek couldn't sleep or eat, that he'd been getting death threats, that their children were being bullied at school because of the scandal. She looked directly at me and asked how I could do this to their family over misunderstandings and lies. James Hernandez cleared his throat and placed a folder on the table. He said he represented Sophie and our family in this matter, and that the church needed to understand the serious legal liability they faced. He explained that Derek's counseling sessions had violated multiple professional boundaries and legal standards for working with minors. He cited specific laws about mandatory reporting, about parental rights to be informed of therapeutic interventions, about physical contact with minors, about one-on-one unsupervised contact between adults and children in youth ministry settings. He said the church's insurance would likely deny coverage if they'd known about Derek's methods and allowed them to continue. He mentioned that he'd already identified at least 3 other families whose children had been in similar counseling with Derek and were now willing to testify about comparable experiences. The room got very quiet. One of the elders, a lawyer named Douglas Crawford, asked James to clarify what he meant by similar experiences. James pulled out written statements from 2 other parents describing their teenagers' personality changes, weight loss, anxiety, and self-harm after intensive counseling with Derek. Both teens had journal entries describing fear-based manipulation and physical punishment presented as spiritual warfare. Douglas's face went gray as he read the statements. Mark tried to regain control of the meeting and said the church had followed all proper procedures and that Derek had been properly vetted and supervised. James asked to see Derek's background check, his professional credentials, his liability insurance, and the documentation of his supervision. Mark stammered that those were confidential personnel records. James said they'd become discoverable in the lawsuit we'd be filing against the church for negligent supervision and enabling abuse. He said we were giving the church one opportunity to handle this appropriately by immediately suspending Derek, cooperating fully with the police investigation, offering to pay for Sophie's therapy, and implementing new child protection policies. If they refused, we'd go public with everything, including the church's failure to protect children despite warnings. I'd never mentioned giving them warnings, but James said it with such authority that several elders looked at each other nervously. Amanda started crying and saying this was a witch hunt, that Derek was innocent. Douglas asked her to step out of the room since she had a conflict of interest. She refused at first, but Mark gently escorted her out. Once she was gone, Douglas said the church needed to take these allegations seriously, regardless of their personal feelings about Derek. The meeting ended with the elders agreeing to suspend Derek pending the police investigation and to hire an independent investigator to review the youth ministry's practices. It wasn't enough, but it was something. James said outside the church that they'd likely try to make this go away quietly, and we needed to be prepared for them to pressure us to drop charges and sign non-disclosure agreements. He said churches hated public scandals and would do almost anything to avoid admitting they'd enabled abuse. Monica said we should document every interaction with church leadership and record conversations when legally possible. The next Sunday, we didn't attend services at Cornerstone. I couldn't face the people who'd been calling me a liar and a troublemaker for protecting my child, but I heard from friends still attending that Mark had addressed the congregation about Derek's arrest. He'd said the church was cooperating with authorities but believed strongly in Derek's innocence, that false accusations against ministers were a common spiritual attack, that the congregation should pray for Derek and Amanda and trust God to vindicate the truth. He'd never mentioned Sophie or acknowledged that a child had been hurt. Several families walked out during his remarks. The police investigation moved quickly once other victims came forward. 2 teenage girls and 1 boy, all between 14 and 16, reported similar experiences with Derek's counseling methods. Fear-based manipulation, isolation from family and friends, physical punishment presented as spiritual discipline, inappropriate touching during prayer. One girl said Derek had told her she needed to confess every sexual thought she'd ever had in explicit detail while he prayed over her. She said he'd made her repeat the confessions multiple times, asking for more specific details each time. Another said Derek had required her to sit on his lap during counseling sessions to practice appropriate father-daughter bonding since her own father had been absent. The boy said Derek had made him strip to his underwear during a session to check for physical manifestations of demonic oppression on his body. Each story made me want to vomit and made me grateful we'd stopped the abuse before it escalated further with Sophie. Detective Moreno said Derek would likely face multiple felony charges and significant prison time if convicted. She said the evidence was overwhelming, especially with 4 victims telling consistent stories and journal entries documenting the abuse in real time. Derek's trial was set for 8 months out, but the church imploded long before then. The independent investigation the elders commissioned found massive failures in youth ministry oversight. Derek had been meeting one-on-one with teens in his locked office with no accountability or supervision. Parents weren't informed about the content or frequency of counseling sessions. Derek had no professional counseling license despite presenting himself as qualified to handle serious mental health issues. The church had never implemented basic child protection policies like 2 adult rules or open-door requirements. The investigators' report recommended terminating Derek immediately, implementing comprehensive safety policies, and offering settlements to affected families. The elder board voted to accept the recommendations, but Senior Pastor Mark resigned instead, saying he couldn't lead a church that didn't trust his judgment about character and calling. Half the congregation left with him to start a new church, taking their tithes and support. They blamed those of us who'd reported Derek for destroying their church family. The other half stayed and demanded accountability and change. Cornerstone Community Church barely survived. Sophie started therapy with a trauma specialist named Dr. Patricia Odom, who had experience with religious abuse cases. The healing process was slow and painful. Sophie had nightmares constantly, couldn't be alone in rooms with closed doors, and panicked whenever she saw bearded men who reminded her of Derek. She'd lost 2 years of normal teenage development and would carry scars from Derek's manipulation for the rest of her life. But slowly, gradually, she started reclaiming herself. She reconnected with friends from school who'd been worried about her withdrawal. She started eating normally again and gained back the weight she'd lost. She stopped flinching when I hugged her. Dr. Odom said Sophie was resilient, and with continued therapy and family support, she'd eventually be able to process what happened and move forward. Paul came home after 3 weeks and apologized for not believing Sophie initially. He said he'd been talking to his own therapist about why he'd trusted church authority over his daughter's well-being. He said his own religious upbringing had taught him never to question pastors or challenge church leaders, that programming ran deeper than he'd realized. He asked Sophie to forgive him, and she did, though their relationship remained strained. Derek's trial happened 11 months after his arrest. All 4 victims testified, describing in painful detail what he'd done to them under the guise of spiritual counseling. The defense argued that Derek had been providing legitimate pastoral care and that the teens had misunderstood his intentions. They brought in expert witnesses who claimed intensive deliverance ministry was biblically sound. The prosecution brought in child psychologists who explained how Derek's methods matched textbook grooming and abuse patterns. They showed the jury photos of bruises, read journal entries describing fear and manipulation, played recordings from Sophie's forensic interview where she described being told she'd cause her brother's death if she stopped attending sessions. Derek's lawyer tried to discredit the victims by highlighting their struggles with anxiety and depression, suggesting they were mentally unstable and unreliable. The prosecutor pointed out that Derek had deliberately targeted vulnerable kids specifically because their existing struggles made them easier to manipulate and less likely to be believed. After 6 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all charges: 4 counts of child abuse, 2 counts of assault, and 3 counts of sexual misconduct with minors. Derek showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Amanda filed for divorce before Derek was even transported to state prison. She released a statement saying she'd been deceived by her husband and had no knowledge of his abuse. She said she'd believed he was doing God's work and felt betrayed discovering the truth. Some people sympathized with her as another victim of Derek's manipulation. Others pointed out she'd been married to him for 6 years and should have seen signs. I didn't know what to believe about her culpability and decided it wasn't my place to judge. My focus was on Sophie's healing and on making sure what happened to her couldn't happen to other kids. I joined a national organization working to implement child protection standards in churches and spent time speaking with other parents about warning signs of spiritual abuse. Many churches resisted implementing policies, claiming they infringed on religious freedom and pastoral authority. I'd argue that protecting children's safety was more important than protecting institutional autonomy, that real spiritual authority would welcome accountability rather than demanding blind trust. Some churches listened and changed their practices. Many didn't, claiming we were overreacting and letting fear dictate ministry. 3 years after exposing Derek, Sophie graduated high school with honors and got accepted to college with a full academic scholarship. She'd survived something that should have destroyed her and emerged stronger. She planned to study psychology with a focus on religious trauma, wanting to help other victims find healing. The night before she left for college, she came into the kitchen where I was washing dishes and hugged me from behind. She said she'd written something she wanted to read at our church's Sunday service and asked if I'd come with her for support. I said of course, surprised she wanted to attend Cornerstone after everything that had happened. She said the new senior pastor had reached out to her and the other victims, apologizing on behalf of the church and asking if there was anything they could do to help their healing. She said his humility and genuine remorse had meant something to her, that she wanted to reclaim church as a safe space, rather than letting Derek's abuse define her relationship with faith. Sunday morning, Sophie stood at the microphone in front of 300 people and spoke clearly and calmly about what Derek had done to her. She described the fear, the isolation, the manipulation disguised as ministry. She explained how his abuse had nearly destroyed her sense of self and her trust in spiritual authority. Then she talked about healing, about learning to distinguish between authentic faith and toxic control, about the responsibility every church member had to protect vulnerable people rather than protecting institutional reputation. She ended by saying she was sharing her story not for sympathy but for accountability, that silence protected predators and truth protected future victims. The congregation gave her a standing ovation, and dozens of people approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking her for her courage and apologizing for not protecting her sooner. Sophie drove away to college the next morning with her trauma integrated rather than buried, ready to transform her pain into purpose. I watched her taillights disappear down the street and finally let myself believe we'd survived the worst and made it through to the other side. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.